like David Rockefeller or Ted Turner or people like that. So really, a lot of this is wasted subsidies that go to people who really don't deserve them. And what's happening is these subsidies, like most government programs, there's the law of unintended consequences. They actually backfire and have the opposite effect of what they're intended to have. Here we are 48 years later after President Nixon declared the war on cancer, and we have more cancer than we did in 1970. The war on terror, there's more terror now than when it first started. The war on drugs, there are more drugs now than when it first started. So this is known as the law of unintended consequences, and this is what happens when you put public money and public funds into a project and you get this blowback and you get a lot of negative consequences. Well, the same thing with the subsidies. What's happening? In order to keep some people afloat, supposedly, ostensibly, what's happening though is we're shifting people's eating habits into high fructose corn syrup because you have corn that's being used for that, for biofuels and the like. And then in turn, these are also fed to poultry and cattle. So even if you don't eat these directly, if you're eating beef or if you're eating chicken, what's happening is you're consuming it as well. So you're getting a lot of GMO corn, and Howard Flieger will talk about this in his speech after this one, his talk, and you will see the hidden dangers and the actual overt dangers of eating GMO foods. But here we have high fructose corn syrup, and it's the #1 source of calories in the United States, and yet it's responsible for obesity, diabetes, non-alcoholic liver fatty disease, and the like. You see people are getting fatter and fatter these days, and it's in large part because of these food subsidies that are going into creating large reserves, large crops of corn and soybean. And soybean, by the way, which I didn't put up here on any of the slides, soy is very estrogenic, and you have a lot of men, boys eating soy now, and the expression soy boys, well, it's basically feminizing the male population in this country, and that's partly because of the subsidies of soybean crops in the U.S. that encourages farmers to create this and lowers the price of all these crops. So again, the law of unintended consequences. So we find them in the high fructose corn syrup is in all of these products. In fact, I've made it a habit when I go to a store, if it has any high fructose corn syrup, and it may have several different names, it's not always identified the same way, then I just don't buy it. It doesn't matter what it is. I will not eat it, whether it's a drink or a food. And even these hidden ingredients in beer, you would think, oh, how could it be in beer? But you'll find high fructose corn syrup in a lot of these beers or ales or IPAs, or you'll find GMO corn. You'll find some other bad ingredients as well, like propylene glycol. But the bottom line is you find a lot of GMO corn syrup or high fructose corn syrup even in beer. And it's so common, of course, books have been written about it. I just highlighted one here, which is a pretty good book called Supersizing Urban America, How Inner Cities Got Fast Food with Government Help. And, oh, what happened to that? There is basically too much money at stake, and what's happening. Can you go back one, or I don't know if I can do it. Yeah, okay, then the next one. Thanks. And what we see is, a lot of these people are being influenced, politicians, of course, by lobbyists, because as they say, it's hard for politicians to decide stuff on their own. So there are a lot of lobbyists out there pushing this. Now, the National Health Federation, we for many years had our own lobbyists, but now it's sort of citizen lobbyists who are out there trying to counteract the big mega corporate and big ag lobbyists who were pushing these programs. does that do that? Thank you. The other problem, though, that people don't think about when you have these farm subsidies is what's happening to the environment. And what we see is the aquifers are going dry because you have all these subsidized crops on marginal land, and what is happening is the farmers are pumping out the water, in this case from the Ogallala aquifer that runs up north and south in that line that you see there. And where it's blue, the aquifers are aquifying, but in the dark areas, the dark brown, the yellow, and the light brown, this is where you have the declines. And you see this in the panhandle of Texas, through the panhandle of Oklahoma, up into Arkansas, Nebraska, and even into South Dakota. So it's a huge, huge problem. And we see these aquifers draining dry. And this has even come to the attention of the National Geographic. You can read about it in that magazine. But the point of the matter is that this cannot continue, and we're losing water because corn, irrigated corn, makes a lot of money for people, but what it doesn't do is it doesn't act without a lot of water. And so these subsidies are increasing the production, and they're draining our underlying aquifers of water. And many areas lose 2 feet of water a year. So what's happening is the parallel to what David Montgomery was speaking about, where we're losing the dirt, here we're losing the water. So this is something that needs to be looked at and needs to be addressed, and it needs to be addressed very quickly. But we get cheap food, but how long will that last? Not very long. And these foods, as I mentioned, make us sick, they make us fat, they make us even crazy. It doesn't want to work anymore. So what's the solution? Well, I don't know if we have any real short-term solutions except to take the tough medicine. We need to end the subsidies, even if they do help some farmers in the long run, and in the largest part, they actually just are engaging in corporate welfare. And the ones who, some will suffer from ending the subsidies, but most will be far better off. And again, I point you in the direction of the law of unintended consequences, which we always need to keep in mind, no matter what the program is. You know, Milton Friedman said once, you put the federal government in charge of the Sahara Desert, and in 5 years' time, you'll have a shortage of sand. And that's what happens with these programs. They have nice intentions, maybe they don't have nice intentions, maybe it's just about corporate welfare, but the bottom line is they definitely have very damaging consequences, and that's what we need to stop. It doesn't like me anymore. I think it ran out of battery power. Thank you. So, culprit number 2. Now, actually, there are a lot of culprits. I'm only going through 3 culprits. But this one is one that leads us into the topic that is in your program, and that is about Codex Alimentarius. And in this case, culprit number 2 is zilpaterol. And I don't know how many here know about zilpaterol. Okay, well, zilpaterol, it doesn't. So Howard's going to be very upset if the clicker doesn't work. But zilpaterol is a vet drug that's given to animals, and the beauty from the standpoint of the animal breeders is that it's sort of what I call the Arnold Schwarzenegger of vet drugs. It bulks the animals up, whether it's a poultry, pigs, cattle, whatever. It gives them more muscle and less fat, so it gives a leaner cut of beef, and it makes them more valuable. So the breeders can make about $15 to $24 extra profit per head. But the problem is that it's toxic to animals and it's toxic to humans. So typically when you give vet drugs to animals, at least 2 weeks before slaughter, they are supposed to be weaned off the vet drug so that the residues in the meat are not consumed by you and me, or at least those of us who are meat eaters. We won't consume it. But in the European Union, for example, they have a very sensible policy. Their policy is if a vet drug is not intended to cure a disease or to treat a disease, then it's not allowed. Well, what is Zilpaterol? It's not meant to cure a disease, it's just meant to make you more profitable, make the animal more profitable. So the problem, though, is it doesn't work unless it's used almost up to the time of slaughter. So there's always residue in the meat. If you're eating beef in the United States or Canada or Mexico or pretty much anywhere in the Western Hemisphere, you are getting dosed, typically, I mean there are exceptions of course, organic beef and the like, but you're getting dosed by Zilpaterol. Certainly if the animal came off a mega farm, mega ranch. And the same with pork, the same with a lot of poultry. In fact, Zilpaterol or ractopamine, the evil twin sister of Zilpaterol, is whatever. Okay, well that's all right. You can go to the next one. Thank you. And but what happens is you have about 20% of the animals losing their hooves. The incidence of death was 80% greater for the Zilpaterol treated animals than for the control group. And then, of course, I already mentioned the residues that humans get. And what effects do we get if we eat Zilpaterol doped meat? Well, basically, we'll have an increased heart rate. We will have vasorestriction or constriction in the body. And some people, many of them, will have panic attacks and or anxiety, or kind of an underlying anxiety that they may not be able to attribute to anything, and certainly not to that barbecue beef sandwich that they had last night. So again, this ties into having cheaper food, because it does make beef cheaper, but not necessarily healthier food. The next slide, please. So what we have here is Codex wants to set a standard for Zilpaterol so it can be sold worldwide. Right now you have the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the Food and Drug Administration dealing with this issue in the United States. Worldwide, what do we have? We have the European Union opposes it, we have China opposing it, we have Russia opposing it, India opposes it, so most of the countries in the world, you can't, buy this or use it. Well, Monsanto, Merck, all these people who are pushing it, Merck in particular, they don't like this situation. So what do? They go to Codex Alimentarius to get a standard set so they can sell it worldwide. Now, I'm going to stop a minute and ask how many people here know what Codex Alimentarius is? Okay, Howard does, and the gentleman behind Howard, and you do, and a few others. So you don't know what it is, but next slide, please. And click it again. It's an international body that was created in 1963. It's a little younger entity than our National Health Federation, but it still exists. And it's meant to harmonize and internationalize food standards. And what this means is, one more please, is that it was created with these stated goals that were ostensibly very noble. That is to eliminate barriers to trade in food and also to protect the consumer. Those are two goals that we agree with. We would like to eliminate international barriers to trade in food, make it easier for consumers to buy, and also to protect the consumer. But their actual goals are a lot different. The motto of Codex is safe, good food for everyone. But what we've found, what the NHF has found, we've been attending these meetings for 20 years, and I myself am in my 19th year of going to Codex meetings, and we have one in the end of November that we'll be going to in Berlin. But what we found is that the real motto, the real logo, whatever you want to call it, for Codex is, good, healthy profits for the corporations. I mean, that's really what their motto should be if there was truth in advertising. Because they've been captured. They've been captured by these special interest groups, and the regulators and the people who make the standards and set the standards and guidelines for all the foods. And this is what they're doing. They've been doing it for all these years. And so just imagine, you know, Codex is not a monolithic entity. It's not like there's a body of law like the US Constitution might be considered as just handed down and then it's all adopted in one fell swoop. It's more like the cars on a freeway. Some cars are just leaving right now to get to their destination. Others have already arrived. Others are midpoint. Others are only a quarter of the way. Well, so too with the standards and guidelines at Codex. Some haven't even been conceived of yet. Others have been set for 20 years now. And so, next slide, please. And so what happens is that these standards are the ones that we are addressing at all these different Codex committee meetings. Now, here's the FAO building in Rome, and I just went last July to the Codex meeting in Rome, where we fought the Zilpaterol issue, and before that we fought it in Chicago at the underlying committee level, and we won. We had a significant victory there in the face of Merck. In fact, it was so great a victory because they were trying to get a standard adopted. Now, again, why is a standard important? It's just Codex. You know, these unelected bureaucrats meet in semi-private locations. You can see them there in the meeting room there in the FAO building, and mostly they're unelected bureaucrats like FDA, USDA, or their equivalents in other countries, meeting and making decisions that affect your health and your lives. And who do we have there? We have those delegates, then we have INGOs, international non-governmental organizations, and almost all of those are trade groups like CropLife, which is a real fancy, nice, warm, heartwarming name for Monsanto's front group. We have Calorie Control Council for the aspartame people. There are all sorts of names there, and then there are trade groups, you know, the International Grocery Manufacturers Association and others. And out of all those INGOs who are accredited to speak out at these meetings and participate and give their input, only 5 are consumer groups. And of those 5, 4 are basically left-wing ones who think that more government the better and don't believe in the free market. And then there's us. And we want to protect the consumer, but we also believe in the free market system. And we do believe that health freedom should exist, that people should have the right to choose for themselves what to consume and what to take. So we're very unique there in what we present and what we argue. And we even have these, I've had African delegates come up to me and they look at my name tag and they say, NHF, who are you? You talk funny. You know, they go, you don't talk like everyone else. And next slide, please. And so what happens is we are there fighting this sort of elitist, top-down driven sort of structure that wants to tell each of us what to do and what to eat. And it's very anti-natural foods, it's anti-supplements. They think the answer to a problem is taking drugs or giving drugs to animals, like Zilpaterol. They're very pro-drug. The Merck-sponsored front group, which is called, misleadingly called Health for Animals, we call by its real name, which it should be its real name, which is Drugs for Animals, because they never met a drug they didn't like. But they pushed drug after drug after drug, and at the meeting where we beat them in April in Chicago, they were so pissed off that what they did is they threatened the whole Codex meeting. They said, well, if this is the way we're treated, then maybe this whole market for drugs will dry up and the discovery of new drugs will be stopped. And so we were over there kind of applauding, but we were the only ones. You know, most of the people there were like, oh no, please, you know, don't do that. It's all about control. Next slide, please. So they create, Codex that is, creates these standards and guidelines. They publish them. You can find them online. You can go to codexalimentarius.org and you can find these standards and guidelines that have been created over the years. But up until 1994, there was very little interest in seeing how, you know, what Codex did or whether they created a guideline. Who really cared? But in 1994, a strange thing happened, an important thing happened, and that is that they created the World Trade Organization. GATT became the WTO, and with it came the enforcement powers that they didn't have before. So what that meant is that now, if a standard was created at Codex, and so you had a country like the United States that wanted to sell its GMO foods worldwide, but was being stopped by the European Union, if they had a standard, they could go to the WTO and say, hey, the EU's, well, the individual countries are members of the WTO, we're members of the WTO, so we want to bring a trade dispute against the EU for not letting in our GMO crops into their markets. And so the first thing, what's the first thing the WTO would do? It will say, is there a Codex standard? Because the Codex standard, if it exists, it's saying, oh, these levels of residue of whatever the drug might be, whether it's or the pesticide or herbicide or whatever, say it's Roundup or glyphosate, if it's there and the crops meet that standard, then there's no excuse for the EU, at least in the WTO's eyes, to forbid the importation of that crop. So then it became very important, and that's when NHF first started getting involved in Codex, was at that time, because suddenly it acquired this enormous importance that continues to this day. So next slide, please. So you have also all these various agreements that countries have signed that tie in Codex. The Sanitary and Phytosanitary Agreement that specifically mentions Codex in its terms. The Central American Free Trade Agreement, which specifically mentions multiple times Codex in its terms. WTO, we already talked about. TPP, we don't really need to worry about, but it's going to morph into something else. And then, of course, the Canadian, you know, now that NAFTA's been changed, then this Canadian-American-Mexican agreement or partnership. Next slide, please. So we are at these meetings, and even though we're only an INGO, I say only, we get to speak out at the meetings. We get to submit written documents at the meetings. We get to interact in real time at the meetings with the delegates. You know, if something's going on and I want to run over and talk to the Russian delegate or to the Ghanaian delegate or someone like that, I can do it. And then we argue. And the funny thing is at these meetings, the decisions are made by consensus. It's not by voting, except very rarely. And the meetings are made by consensus. So those who make the most loud noise sort of win. And the chairman or the chairwoman get to decide who's making the most noise. You know, sort of like that old program from the 50s, Queen for a Day, the applause meter, and you know, whoever made the most noise for the particular mother, then she became the queen for the day. Well, that's really a dated thing, but anyway, it still applies at Codex. And so by us speaking out at this meeting, we add to the noise against these bad standards, or maybe add to the noise in favor of the good standards. So we actually are punching far above our weight, where we're sitting there toe-to-toe with the US delegation, or more likely the Australian delegation, who has never met a Codex, an unhealthy Codex standard it didn't love, and arguing with them. The next slide, please. So what we do is we speak for you. This is in Moscow in 2013. I gave a speech there to the assembled delegates. Next slide, please. And this is just about us. And don't want to take away from FARFA, because FARFA actually does kind of domestically a lot of the things we're doing internationally, so it makes kind of a nice match. We've been around for 63 years. We've been really successful at Codex. You know, the first 10 years we went, we were losing time after time. We were ridiculed, we were sidelined, but it just goes to show you the importance of being persistent. You know, you just have to be persistent, because starting in about the 10th year, what happened is we started winning. We won on the vitamin and mineral levels, where they were trying to dump down the RDAs for vitamins like selenium, well, minerals and vitamins like selenium, vitamin C. They were trying to knock it down from 60 milligrams a day to a miserable, which was already miserable, to down to 45 milligrams and so on. Next slide, please. And so we have been fighting what we see as the ignorance at Codex on a lot of these things. We took aluminum out of 3/4 of the food additives. We kept melamine contamination out of infant formula. I remember going to a meeting in Rotterdam. So this time I've gone to this particular committee meeting, because they have different committees, you know, for different sort of subject matters and so on. And so I went to the one on contaminants in food, and they were proposing a sky's the limit exemption for melamine. We all know what melamine is. You know, it's like the tabletop stuff, and they coat food processing equipment in it. And the Chinese back in, when was it, the 90s or early 2000s, they poisoned a whole bunch of cats and dogs because they put melamine into the cat food and dog food and killed 100,000 cats and dogs. And they also put it in infant formula later. Chinese have a very interesting way of dealing with that problem, though. They put a bullet in the back of the head of the people who did it, and then that kind of temporarily solves the problem, but it's a continuing problem. But anyway, at Codex, Australia, always the bad guy, was pushing to have, if melamine came in from the packaging, you know, even that aseptic packaging has a nice thin coating of melamine on it. You know, if you go into a 7-Eleven and you buy one of those aseptic packages of drink mix, it has a melamine lining there, because it's very, you know, impermeable to liquids, and it's very cheap and lightweight. Well, what happens if you have acidic drink in there, if it's just water, nothing really happens, but if you have something acidic, it's going to leach out that melamine into the drink, and then you drink it. And so they were wanting this for infant formula. Well, if it leaches into the infant formula for babies, you know, no big deal. So I was the only one to kind of raise my hand and say, would this be a mistake? And they looked at me like I was the man on the moon. You know, who is this guy? We haven't seen him before in this particular meeting. And it became a big fight. But over a 3-year period, we just kept persisting. And we kept gathering, a snowball gathering of allies. We had the Central American countries, you know, the Costa Rican, the Panamanian, Bolivian also, Peruvian ladies. They got into this Hispanic sort of, you know, coffee clatch, and they exchanged views, and they supported us. And then we picked up some African countries, then we picked up some others, and we kept losing at each stage, because it has to go through this 8-step process to be finally adopted. So we were losing. But each time we were getting more and more support, till it finally went to step 8, and we had so much support that the chairwoman for the commission meeting there in Rome sent it back down to the committee to be reconsidered. And there, we totally turned it around, and Australia even withdrew its support for that, and we got it completely blocked at that meeting. So this is the power of what you can do, and this affects 7 billion people worldwide. Next slide, please. So again, we fought ractopamine. It's not all been success stories. We lost on ractopamine. Glyphosate is still a continuing battle. The active ingredient Roundup. I know David Montgomery spoke about it, but I was like flinching every time he talked about glyphosate, Roundup being applied to our food. I mean, that's a killer. So I don't care how healthy the soil is, it's not going to stay healthy if you apply glyphosate to it. So victory over Zilpaterol. So far in 2 years' time, we have to fight this battle again, and Merck will have assembled its forces, and it will be back in force. I mean, we have like 1 or 2 people at each of these meetings. They have an army. They have like 14. On glyphosate, they had like 40 delegates at these meetings. So we go with our, you know, our sort of budget economy fare, you know, thing, and they stay in these fancy hotels and fly first class and all of that. But we also reduce mercury levels in fish, at least the allowed mercury levels. Next slide, please. Now, I don't think this will work. This was a speech that I gave a couple of years ago in Geneva at the Codex Alimentarius Commission meeting, the overriding body. And can you click it and see if it plays? I don't think it will, but it doesn't really, no, that's all right. It does, we'll get it ironed out. It's the first time I tried to embed a video into the slide presentation. So next slide, please. But before I get off the topic, let me just say, because on the integrity speech, one of the things that I sort of took to that particular meeting was the fact that we needed to have integrity in our foods and integrity in our standards at Codex. And I was speaking to almost 700 delegates at this meeting. And it was sort of like the first time they had heard this, because they were just there trying to, you know, their 9-to-5 job, doing what they could. But I grew up in Texas. I was born and bred in Texas. I live in Europe now, but for most, I shouldn't say most of my life, but a large part of my life I was from here. My family immigrated to Texas in the 1830s in Stephen F. Austin's second land grant. And I had ancestors who fought in the Battle of San Jacinto. So I have really strong Texas roots. But a lot of that has to do with some integrity that I find in a lot of Texans, and maybe not the Yankee transplants, but you know, the native Texans, a lot of that. And I took that, and that was the substance of that speech there. But anyway, I didn't want to forget to tell you about that part. But here, the number 3 culprit. Again, we have many culprits, but number 3 culprit for cheap food, that's unhealthy food, we have biofortification. So I'll just read it from the screen because it's stated so well there. You know, it's a process of increasing the density of vitamins and minerals in a crop through plant breeding or agronomic practices, so that the biofortified crops, when consumed regularly, will generate measurable improvement in vitamin and mineral nutritional status. And this is a definition that they want to have at Codex. Well, it's a bit more involved than this definition, but next slide, please. But what we found, even though we were early supporters of this is where they want to increase the, say, the vitamin content of rice, you know, improve vitamin A so that people, when they eat it, they'll get more vitamin A. Increase the mineral content of potatoes so they're more iron-rich and the like, and they do it through conventional breeding techniques. But Monsanto saw this as a chance to hijack the process, hijack the definition, and insert GMO foods this way, where they'll be given the name biofortified foods. And then we will all be tricked into eating these biofortified foods. So there's a big fight going on, and it will continue in Berlin next month when we are there, fighting over this definition, and I hope and I think we will win. But the funny thing about this, and it occurred to me while I was listening to David Montgomery's speech about the soil, is, although we've already argued this, of course, earlier, last year's meeting, is that if they just properly tended to the soil, they wouldn't even need these kind of crops. You know, we would already have vitamin-rich potatoes, mineral-rich potatoes, vitamin-rich rice, and the like. So they're kind of going about it backwards. They're trying to correct a problem that actually occurs in the soil itself, and they could address it that way more easily and do us a lot of good. Next slide, please. What we need is soil and food integrity, and this is what we argue, and it really dovetails with David Montgomery's speech too, in a sense. And this is what we argue at Codex. You know, we want to protect the soil, the bees, and aquatic life, and this is all kind of novel to a lot of these delegates at Codex meetings. So it's kind of strange that we are often, not always, but often the only ones speaking about this at those meetings. And we fight the antibiotic resistance and the other threats to our health, these things that are going on. So again, they can make our processed foods cheaper, but at what cost to our health? Next slide. That would have been easier to read. Sorry about that. So, to do, we have a saying at NHF, you know, politicians don't see the light, they just feel the heat. So if you want to be an activist on these subjects, then what you need to do is be what we are at Codex and also elsewhere, but be persistent. You know, just go there, be persistently vocal. Write an email, write a letter, call them on the phone, visit them in person alone, visit them in person with your family and friends, and then start the process over again, just until they are so sick and tired of hearing from you and all these others that they'll beg you to stop, and they'll promise to do what you want. Write letters to the editor, internet blogs, the like, and always challenge, challenge, challenge if you see other competing contrarian, say, views in the press or in the media, and so challenge those. And then, of course, educate yourself, which you're doing right now. And then join with the others to act together. You know, I encourage everyone who isn't already a member of FARFA to join FARFA. I'm a member of FARFA. And also, please join us, National Health Federation, because it's members like you who send us to these Codex meetings to be your only voice speaking there. Next slide, please. We have a magazine. Some of you, I noticed, already have it, but please go down to the table at the entryway and you'll find it and take it. It's free. And there's a Codex book there too. It's getting a little out of date, but it will show you what we're doing and have done in the past. It'll explain it maybe in a more detail than I can do it here. But if you're a member, you get a subscription to this magazine. Next slide. And then go to our website. You can join directly on the website, and then you can see what we have there. We had so many enemies that they attacked our website, took it down multiple times, and I guess they really didn't like what we had to say. But it's back up, and I encourage you to go there. And you can also sign up on our email list, and it would be good to have more members and more supporters. Next slide, please. We're also on Facebook. Go on Facebook. There's a National Health Federation group there. Like our page if you would. Next slide. And just remember, again, this is sort of the flip side or part and parcel with the being persistent. So success. And when we've had success at Codex, it's been because of these incremental small steps that we've taken that add up. And I'd encourage each and every one of you to remember this point and to keep at it. Take these small steps that will allow you to succeed, no matter what it is, whether it's in being an activist or in your personal life. Next slide, please. And also remember, we don't have to be the majority. We just have to be a very vocal and focused minority, and those are the ones who make the changes in society. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Margaret Mead spoke those words some time ago. Next slide, please. So, and then also keep in mind that your life is your message to the world. So make sure it's inspiring. You know, one of the things I do, I'm an attorney. I could be making a lot of money right now just working in a big law firm doing stupid cases, but it's more important to me to make a difference in the world than to make money. So that's why we do it, and we make our sacrifices, but I find more fulfillment from making a difference in the world and making money. So I hope you do too. Anyway, thank you, and if there are any questions, I'm happy to take them. No questions? Oh, I see. You're being so good. Well, I see I've explained things so completely thoroughly. No questions. Except for the people in the back who need to wake up. So, let's see. Oh, yes, sir.
Well, listen, I'll go ahead. Thank you. I've heard you speak before, and it's tremendously frightening and nightmare causing. So that's the problem. Is it becomes so overwhelming that the average person just needs to put their hand up and say, I can't deal with that now.
It's true, yeah.
And there's a parallel problem with global paragovernmental control through the Cartagena Protocol, where the U.S. and New Zealand and Australia and a few other companies are pushing biotechnology and synthetic biology through that process. So there's two questions. Could you talk about the synthetic biology initiatives, if you are familiar with them, but really talk about how you deal with, how do you sleep at night, knowing what you know, not just dead serious.
Well, it's a good question. I'm not as much up on the synthetic biotechnology issues because they haven't come up yet at Codex, but they will. I have my hands full. We're not a large staff to deal with the Codex issues, so I have my hands full dealing with the current ongoing issues. But I have read some about those, and they are important, and they're things that need to come up, including what our executive director, who's right here, Kat Carroll, who's our NHF executive director, has pointed out on robotics and artificial intelligence and other issues that are coming up as well that we need to and will need to address in the future. But in terms of sleeping at night, actually I sleep very well because I know I've at least been, in there fighting. I guess I wouldn't sleep as well if I were not doing anything at all. And so that makes a difference, but I had to do a lot of traveling. I mean, we fought the over-vaccination issue in Italy. I was in Italy every weekend last summer, almost giving speeches before crowds in Venice and Treviso and Trieste and Rome and other places. And it really made a big impact. And then in Sweden, we have a significant group there that actually won on the mandatory vaccination issue. So we deal with other issues than just pure, simple food issues. But actually, I sleep better knowing that I do those things. But the jet lag may keep me from sleeping. Anyway, thank you for that. Did you have a question? You were in the yellow shirt. Oh, okay. It looked like you did. Oh,
Does
sorry.
your website give an overview of what all you do?
What the NHF does? Yeah. The NHF has been involved in stopping fluoridation of water, public water supplies. That was one of our big issues early on. Another issue is if you've ever gone to a chiropractor, you can thank the National Health Federation because chiropractors were in the 50s and 60s badly under attack by the American Medical Association, and we created a whole separate licensing stream for them to take them out from under the ambit of the American Medical Association so that chiropractors could practice without fear of being persecuted. So we were involved in that. In the vitamin and mineral levels, we're actually responsible for you being able to continue to get supplements in stores, because in the 80s they were trying to stop that, and we stopped it in the 80s, and again in the 90s, but in the 90s I have to give credit where credit's due. There were other organizations involved in that fight with the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, so it wasn't just us. For 40 years though, we were the only game in town. We were the only health freedom organization in the US. So we fought also on the over-vaccination issue. We have some members who still believe in vaccines, but there are large numbers who don't. Regardless, the umbrella for the NHF is big enough to cover both camps. And so the vaccine issue, and now Codex, and again, we're the only health freedom group at Codex fighting for you there, and that is really the global battle that really, when you want to focus and pinpoint one area, that is it, because it affects 7 billion souls worldwide. And if you make an impact there, you can make a huge difference. And that's why all these big corporations, the pharmaceutical industry, the big ag companies are dumping so much money into it. You know, just on that Zilpaterol issue, why Merck was so, and I'll just say it again, pissed at us, NHF, because we were so key at stopping Zilpaterol in April from moving up the 8-step chain to becoming a standard, that they even went, I don't have my phone on me, but imagine I did, they took their phone and found their Facebook page where we called Codex Science junk science, and they went up to the Codex scientists at the head table, said, look what NHF is saying about you, junk science. And they went to the Codex Secretariat and said, look, here's a photo of you with Scott Tips. Boy, that's not going to look good. You know, of course, they do it all the time. So there's nothing, in our case at least, abnormal or wrong about it. We weren't paying him money or anything like I'm sure they do with a lot of the scientists. But in any event, when we came back from lunch, because this was just before the lunch break, and it's funny, I was sitting at the seat, we had just won this victory, and there I see the Merck representative up there showing something on his phone, and it turns out it was this junk science Facebook post that we had just made. And I came back from lunch, and I came a little bit later because I had to take a phone call, and I came into the room and everyone was applauding the head table because he had just condemned NHF for calling their science junk science, and they had to explain, no, it is not junk science, it's real science. You know, he's kind of like pleading with the, and everyone's standing and applauding. And it's the first time, I think it's the first time that this has ever happened in Codex history that we know of, and I've been going to the meetings, like I said, this is my 19th year of going, where they publicly condemned from the podium one of the members, you know, attendees of the meeting. And it was very, very strange. So I wrote an article, in fact, in one of the magazines, it's not this one, but I have a few, I think, that are out on the table. It is the article that explains that. But if you don't get that magazine, you can go online, and on our homepage, we have the whole story of what happened. And it's actually, if I do say so myself, I think it's pretty interesting, and you'll get a better understanding of how the Codex process works. And there's a question behind yours. Or did I answer your question enough? Okay.
No, I'm sorry. I was wanting to know a little bit more. I know we talked about supplements and other things that were affecting our health, but I directly wanted to know how, like with alternative, practitioners and just supplements, because at one point in time, regardless of what your form of payment was, you were able to purchase supplements or certain teas and things of that nature. And then like 5 to 8 years ago, like SNAP or EBT, they stopped allowing recipients to purchase certain herbs and things and teas. And so a lot of things have changed, and I'm kind of lost with that, and I kind of thought I was going to learn more about that.
You know, it's a really excellent question. And you know, the funny thing about it is we've had some of our NHF members write me and say, would you please get NHF involved in that issue, the very one you're talking about, and having supplements be reimbursed by, healthcare insurance and the like. We haven't really addressed that as much as I'd like, just because of sort of conservation of resources. But it is something we will take up, and it is an issue because they obviously subsidize, again, subsidies going on here. They subsidize the drugs, but not the natural stuff that would help keep you from getting sick and keep you from needing those very drugs. So it's a really good question. I don't have a happy answer on it because it hasn't been it hasn't happened yet where where these things are actually